265.
Ding. There's no better thing than when we hear Jared, our man over there in the studio, say, going live. And of course, we screw something up anyway. Why, what the heck?
What was that sound? I don't know.
Yeah, we've had a lot of things already going on this morning that are kind of interesting on this huge holiday.
That's right.
I don't know how huge, but holiday of some sort.
Pete, up there in Minnesota, is it Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day?
It is Indigenous Peoples Day because, we've got huge community. As you know, we got Hiawatha and we got this, we got that. We are very leaning on that whole thing or whatever, for sure.
First Nation.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
First Nation. Well, down here in Puerto Rico, they still think that Columbus discovered America instead of Leif Erikson. Like in Minnesota, folks, they think Leif Erikson discovered it. So
they're adamant.
He's one of theirs, Pete. So they celebrate. They've been putting off fireworks and everything down here.
That's great.
Puerto Rican brothers and sisters. All right. You guys are tuned into the Rebel's Edge. And we always start off with the macro minute, fantastic futures, about for stock or, broad market topics, give you our take, and then some sports. So let's start off, Pete, with the macro minute. Plunge protection team. If you haven't heard of the PPT, it does exist. It's been acknowledged a couple times, actually, Pete, by various members, but we don't know who runs it. Is it the Fed? Who does it? In other words, when the market's plunging, who steps into the breach and buys? I don't think it was Stevie Cohen. I don't think it was Larry Fink. I think it was the Plunge protection team, Pete. Who do you think?
I think you are 100% spot on. 110% from Step Brothers. Anyway, I'm going to tell you this. I think when you look at today, this holiday makes it kind of interesting as well, John, just because we are seeing far less volume early on. And some names are obviously very active, but far less volume in terms of the options world, very, very quiet after a monstrous day on Friday. And I think this bank holiday is certainly kind of at least tempering things a little bit. So I'll give that maybe about 1%, and I'll give the Plunge protection group that actually keeps on buying every time we sell off. I think you're right about that one.
Yeah, it's almost embarrassing because not that market bouncing or going up is a bad thing, but if you're artificially supporting the market, what happens when you run out of that cash to do that? We'll see. But yeah, it's something to behold. All right. How about this one, Pete? Fantastic futures.
Fantastic futures.
That's Pete's favorite. Yeah, I was going to say that's Pete's favorite part of the show every day, folks. And
exciting.
Today's fantastic future, how could you look past oil? Because it had about a 4% rally. And even with the Plunge protection team, Pete, they can't really stop it because this one's supply and demand, and there ain't any sellers of crude oil right here.
You're right about that. And because you were going that direction, a lot of the time, folks, we don't talk to each other about what our topic is going to be, but sometimes we see it. And I saw that John was talking crude. So rather than going the crude route, I'm going to go gold and silver. And what's interesting, John, is when you take a look at the price of gold, back in September, it was $1,967. It's $1,865 now. It's $100 less. And then when you look at silver from 25 into the 21s, just gives you a little bit of a perspective of different parts of the market, what things are happening. We talk about the dollar often. We talk about the 2-year, the 10-year, and sometimes even the 30-year often. But, I think it's also interesting to see what's going on in the precious metals and how badly they are performing over the last month or so.
Yeah, and that's even with, Pete, another war that has broken out because it's a declared war. This is not a mopping up exercise or anything else. Again, our hearts go out to people on both sides because there are innocents on both sides. Palestinians, Israelis, but there were some terrorists that came across from the Palestinian side into Israel, killed roughly 1,000 people. Israel's retaliation will probably do that in spades. And that's not the only war going on in the world, Pete. We've also got, our poor forefathers and, relatives in Armenia are fighting against folks in Azerbaijan. We've got the Ukraine, Russia situation. I mean, how could I not pick Lockheed Martin, Pete, as one of the big stocks that you should be watching here? It's up 8%. It had been kind of bleeding off. So you think maybe they made a phone call and said, hey, this would be a good time to ramp up some of those Apache helicopters or some of those F-16s or whatever. These guys make everything. C5 Galaxies, Pete. Lockheed, if you wanted something that supplies war efforts as well as defense, we all know that defense is part of it. But when you're going through a lot of equipment with all these wars, the defense contractors tend to do pretty well. That's why I'm looking at Lockheed Martin LMT.
And I'm glad you decided to go that direction, John, because when you talk about the geopolitical environment that we're in right now, everything that's going on, it makes a lot of sense, except when you look at the stock price of Lockheed Martin and you say, what's going on? Why are they so far off those 52-week highs? And I don't know how long that's going to last, but I think this is certainly an area that you're going to want to look at a little bit closer than maybe you have. And oh, by the way, they just added an additional $6 billion to the buybacks they already had to make it a total of $13 billion. So somebody thinks that Lockheed Martin might be a little bit too cheap right now, John. It's trading at a 14 PE. That's significantly lower than just about everybody else. And along the way, how about this? Free cash flow, $5 billion. So I'll tell you, there's a lot of reasons right now that I think you'd want to have at least LMT sitting somewhere on your board when you're looking at what do you want to invest in. I think this is one of those names that you want to take a long look at.
Well, they also increased the dividend after the bell on Friday, Pete, to $3.15 from $3. So, they're giving money to perfect strangers. Let's talk about the other big defense mover today. There are a bunch of them. We could have talked about RTX and all the rest, or Harris, but NOC, Pete, Northrop Grumman. Everything you want about UAVs, unmanned vehicles and things, call them drones or whatever, these guys have it. And so whether you're talking about Humvees, or things that look a lot like Humvees, these guys at Northrop make them. Look at that one with an automated gun on top, Pete, that basically, just like the helicopters, wherever the driver looks, that gun goes. So you think they're going to be looking for a lot more of these in all of these different wars that we've got going on? I think so. That's why I'd say this is another one to keep your eye on. It's up 10% today, heavy volume, integrated avionics, high energy laser solutions, Pete, which is like next gen warfare, all of that on Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Battle command systems, they do just a little bit of everything, John, and they really do. But when this stock at the highs, 52-week highs, it's 556. It's trading at 460. It's not that far off the 52-week lows. So again, this is one that I think should be a bit of a head turner to at least pay attention to it and make decisions on your own, of course. But 17 PE, it's a little bit higher, still extremely low in relative terms, and $4 billion in free cash flow. There's a lot of reasons to be interested in this particular sector right now, John, when we're talking about defense and command centers and everything else that both of these two do, as well as some of the others out there, as you pointed out. So I think it is something that you should turn your head and take a look at a lot of these various names and decide whether or not this fits into something that you'd want to invest in. The modernization of air and missile defense and all the rest of that, I think this is a very, very topical thing, and it's only going to get bigger, John. We still look at China every day and wonder, when is something going to happen there? What about North Korea? What's going on? There is so many different hotspots right now that I think that from an investment standpoint, how can you potentially do well? Well, I think the demand is going to be there very, very rapidly.
Yep. absolutely, Pete. And I would say that under normal circumstances, normal being like 10 years ago, before ESG was so big, I would say these guys would have got more love, Pete. But there's a lot of companies right now that really are investment vehicles that don't invest in tobacco. They don't invest in defense and things like that because they feel that it's unattractive. But I think it's going to be more attractive for those of us who actually look at what's going on in the world rather than whether something has an ESG score. All right, let's take a look at Mora Therapeutics, because last week, Pete, they had a big jump. And it turned out that something might have leaked, because that big jump resulted in a $5.8 billion takeover deal. But why is that stock down, Pete?
Well, it's considered, John, this is what at least is the only idea that makes any sense at all. Maybe this is a low ball bid and people are frustrated about it, and so they're not buying into it, and it's kind of raising a little bit of attention. I can give you this. How about this? In July, it was a $30 stock. So you say, well, this thing's somewhere kind of north of $60 or thereabouts or whatever. What a deal. It makes a little bit of sense. It was a $230 stock back in November of 2020. So this thing's been all over the place, and maybe they are getting it at a low level right now. And we're talking about Bristol Myers is the company that's trying to buy them. But, it's an interesting reaction. I don't know that I recall seeing anything quite like this one, John, where, the bid comes in, the stock kind of gets a little bit of a leap, but then all of a sudden just falls right back. And it makes you kind of question, well, is this going to be something that works? Are they going to actually be able to execute this and get done at the price that was originally offered, that was agreed upon? That's going to be very, very interesting to see how this unfolds over the next weeks, months, whatever. But certainly interesting, if nothing else.
Very. And it gives the door is kind of left open, Pete, for somebody else to come through that door with a higher bid, like you say, because this did seem like something that would generate more like a $6.5 billion or even $7 billion deal. And it's 5.8 from Bristol Myers, as Jim Cramer would say. All right. What about Jets, Pete? JETS. Now, I thought this was interesting, so I wanted Jared to pull it up. This is from last week, Pete. And it's not that the Wall Street Journal's wrong, because they're not. But what they did was they ran a piece and they said, hey, here are the sectors that do well because oil prices slipped. Hey, they came down from 94. They came all the way down here to 81 or whatever, $80. Well, now they are right back up, Pete, because that big 4% jump we talked about. So what was on that list? Cruise lines, airlines, and transport of all types, whether it's ships or big trucks, over the road truckers and things like that. All of that was positive last week, you could just throw it upside down and say, yeah, this is negative now because of where oil's going.
Well, and John, when you break this whole thing down, I mean, all we got to do is go back to July when we were talking about under $70 oil, and suddenly we get the cuts and everything else starts to make that move. We get all the way up there. We absolutely rock it. We're getting closer and closer to triple digits, and then we start on this fallback. Well, we've fallen back, but I'll tell you, John, with what's going on in the Middle East, and obviously that's going to stir things up, and whether or not we do anything here in the U.S. to change what's going on from an energy perspective, there's a lot of questions being asked. And I can tell you this, with the jump that we're seeing today in crude, it makes total sense because the input cost into something in the world with jets, whether it's Delta or American or whomever, and throw in forget just that. I mean, let's also consider the fact that you've got, like you brought up, cruise ships, all the rest of it. There are a lot of different things, I think, in place right now that make this a very, very interesting trade based upon crude and what's happening with crude in terms of what's happening with some of these jet stocks. And with that, we've seen some put buying start to heat up just a little bit on the JETS, jets.
Yep. I think that particular ETF is going to be a popular way for people to express that broad market opinion now that they each have pretty much, Pete, adopted various things to keep from their workers from striking. That is, they're paying their pilots more, ground staff more, but now that big swing's going to happen back and forth from demand, because quite frankly, Pete, some of the demand for overseas travel is probably cut a little, maybe not a lot yet, but a little, by what went on over the weekend in Gaza. And you've also got the fact that crude oil is moving that direction, up, not down.
Yeah.
All right. What do you got as far as our sports, Pete? Were there any shockers this weekend in college football or anything like that?
I don't think there was any shockers in the top group, John, but I think what I wanted to focus in on about college football that I think is fantastic is how about the parity in college football right now? I mean, the reality is this. The world suddenly said, well, there's nobody like the SEC. I mean, let's get real. I mean, they're the best conference ever, and every single team is better than most of every team in any other conference, and all the BS that we had to put up with. Well, parity is back, John, and I'll give you an example. Of the SEC teams in the top 5 going into this past weekend, Georgia was the only one. They are number 1, but they're the only one. No, Bama's not there. Sorry, folks. No, Ole Miss ain't there. Sorry to you guys. But when you look over next, you've got Michigan, number 2. Michigan took care of business against the Gophers and Nebraska. They outscored those two teams 97-17 in the last 2 weeks. Gives you a little idea. I was at the Gopher game this past week. Well, it was actually the Michigan game. And I can tell you this, the Wolverines are real. They look like men. They look like an NFL team. They do not look like a college football team. They are absolutely loaded. Doesn't mean they're going to win the whole thing, but they are damn good. I will tell you that right now. They are. Jim Harbaugh has them playing. How about Texas was number 3? They went up against Oklahoma. Both these two are where again? Oh, they're in the Big 12. They're going to the SEC. But they ain't there yet, and they've been in the Big 12 forever. So that game was great, and Oklahoma came out on top. They were ranked number 9. I think they're going to jump a few spots this week and get a lot higher than that. Then you've got Ohio State sticking with the Big 10. You got 2 from the Big 10. You got 2 from the Big 12. You got 1 from the SEC. Lastly, Florida State took care of business. They beat LSU. And you take a look at what they've been able to do. They beat LSU early. They beat a very good Clemson team. They've beaten a lot of different teams, and Florida State, ACC, another one, just showing you there is parity right now in college football. So I think there's a lot of fun things that go along with this, and I think the Pac-12 still, as an entire group, is the best conference in college football this year. But I'll tell you what, John, somebody's going to lose each and every weekend. Oregon didn't have to play last week. They were on a bye. They got to play this week. Washington is who they're playing. One of the two of them is going to drop. But either way, I look at the Pac-12 right now and I say, you know what? I know there'll be the Pac-2 next year. But right now, as the Pac-12, these guys are loaded. What do you think of all this? Do you believe in the parity side?
Well, even with the NIL money, Pete, that some of these schools, you mentioned a lot of them. Obviously, Oregon has unlimited NIL from Nike, literally unlimited. I don't know if they have to spend it, but they have very deep pockets. Bama, same story. To a certain extent, Pete, Colorado's been doing pretty well with their NIL money as well. I think Louisville must have some deep pockets there too. Did you see the Irish go up against the Louisville Cardinal, Pete?
Yeah.
I mean, they were undefeated. Guess what? Louisville is still undefeated, 6-0 now. So they've got some players on that team. That was no fluke because, again, I emphasize they were 5-0 going into the game with Notre Dame. And you and I both thought and probably still think Notre Dame's a really good team. And if you beat up on Notre Dame, that's impressive. To me, anyway, it was impressive. So I thought also the comeback by LSU was pretty impressive, Pete, because Missouri might not be great, but I thought that was a very interesting game.
Well, and I'll tell you, Missouri was undefeated. Missouri was a good football team. They still are a good football team, and that was just a battle. And you know what? This year, for whatever reason, LSU has lost some of those big scoring, very tight games very late into the game. They've been in those games, but they've lost some of them. And sometimes that's just going to happen. But I'll tell you what, that's another team, Missouri, that I think you got to watch out for. There's a lot of teams like that, John. When you look across college football, the landscape, it's incredible. And it does show you just how good and how big football has become, where they can actually have great athletes at places like Louisville, as well as USC, as well as Washington State and Washington, Oregon and Oregon State. You just go down the line. This is an unbelievably athletic group of kids that are playing college football at these high levels. It's unreal. All right, how about the NFL, John? So,
All right.
are there any surprises there right now? I don't know if I'm surprised, you're surprised, but I'm happy to see that they're executing the way we expected. But how about those Detroit Lions? I mean, every week we talk about how much you love Dan Campbell. I love Dan Campbell. You get him in the locker room. He gets into his conversations with all the guys and goes through his post game and everything. And, there's just something special. And those guys play defense. I mean, they play out on both sides of the ball, right? I mean, they got a great running game. They got Jared Goff is playing out of his mind. He's doing a great job. Laporta, who they drafted, the tight end from Iowa, he's turned into exactly what they thought he would be. First-round pick. This kid is the real deal. And you go across, and then you look at the Dolphins, and you see a running back nobody's ever heard of for the Dolphins. He's a kid out of Texas A&M. He had 11 carries for 150 yards, John. I didn't stutter. 150 yards. I mean, unbelievable. And then you look at Tyreek Hill. Well, you got a little speed on that team. Everywhere you look at the Dolphins, they are fast. They are good. And then you got the Eagles undefeated. Then you got the Chiefs 4-1. The Chiefs don't look quite like they did last year, but nonetheless, they're winning football games, John, and they're doing it as usual with the offense. So that's pretty interesting. But is anybody as good right now as the 49ers? And my answer is no. Now, you might say, well, Philadelphia. I look at the 49ers. The 49ers had Philadelphia in a really bad spot at the end of the year. And by the way, Brock Purdy has never lost a game in the NFL that he finished the game in the NFL. And he did not finish that game last year against Philadelphia. So it's really interesting because here's a guy who is Mr. Irrelevant, all that kind of thing, and everything everybody is wanting to say about him. But all he does is win. All he does is the kid's got a much better arm than everybody talks about. You got McCaffrey. I mean, you look around, you've got Bosa on defense, you've got Greenlaw, and I'll tell you what, those two linebackers, John, I watched the game last night. Those two linebackers are mean, fast, athletic. I mean, they are everything you would want. And then they've got that monstrous, great defensive line in front of them. Bosa, I don't know what that guy's on. I'm not saying he's on anything, but I'm saying I don't know what he's on. But that guy is shredded. He's crazed, and he is getting after quarterbacks like I have not seen a player do in a long time. He doesn't have a lot of sacks this year because they're doubling and tripling him. And what does that do? Well, it opens up the other side of the defensive line because you and I both know you got 11 on 11 no matter how it breaks down. You put too many guys on one guy, somebody else is going to get free. This is a really fun year. Again, showing a lot of parity. But look at how good some of these top-tier teams are in the NFL right now.
Yeah, well, and one of them, Pete, you talked about the two NFC teams. Best team in the AFC ain't the Chiefs. Your Vikings could have beat them yesterday. I mean,
I think so.
It was pathetic on both sides. It was pathetic. I know it was 27-20, so people are going to say, yeah, they did what they had to do to win. And, obviously Mahomes looks like he's Mahomes. But that is not the same team as the Super Bowl team last year. Best team in the AFC, Pete, Miami Dolphins. Elite offense, can put points up on anybody. They've got some pretty salty dudes on defense too. And they just beat the spread every effing week, Pete. It was 12 this week. I bet it. They won by 15. They are just a spread beating machine. Forget about the 70 points they scored in that one. Not this week, of course, a couple weeks ago against the hapless Broncos. But I mean, there are a lot of reasons to really want to watch that. I would watch Dolphins, 49ers, Dolphins, Eagles Dolphins, Kansas City all day. Those would be my favorite matchups. I'll tell you one I was surprised about, Pete, but happily surprised. Lawrence over there playing overseas for the last 2 weeks, so nobody's seen him, right? I mean, unless you get up early, you haven't seen him because, it's over in London. So all he did was just carve up the Bills. He exposed that defense. And I'll grant you that defense is without their big defensive end rush guy, Pete. He's still out, got hurt last season. He's still out. But boy, do they need him back because they do not have people that are putting enough pressure. Yeah, he got hit. Trevor got hit a couple times, and sometimes it seemed a little late to me, but I didn't have any money on the game. I was just watching, but he made crucial third down throws again and again and again. And Buffalo was exposed by that, I think, because anybody looking at that's going to say, all right, let's do the same thing. Let's flood the zone right and throw left. Let's flood the zone left and throw right, back and forth, back and forth. And he threw him to the same guy, Pete. I mean, it was always the same guy. So I think that guy really looked good, and he's finally getting to go back home. He was overseas for 10 or 11 days because at least that seemed like a relatively smart thing that the NFL did was keep the team over there so that, you can kind of get used to that massive time change. But at least they're also an East Coast team, so it's only 5 hours instead of, can you imagine an 8-hour when you put a West Coast team out there? But that it looked like Bills Stadium. It was packed. It was all done up like the Bills Stadium would be, but it was Tottenham, Pete, and it was pretty interesting to watch.
Yeah, and I think everybody forgets about Jacksonville, John, and they shouldn't, because last year they were in the playoffs. They actually were a playoff team. They're a good team, well-coached team. They fired that idiot Meyer, and they got a better coach, and they've done a great job. And Trevor Lawrence has gotten to be a better pro quarterback. And so everything you're talking about makes total sense to me. They're talented in a lot of different spots. They've got some receivers, running backs. ETN is a total stud out of Clemson. He came out the same year with Trevor Lawrence. So there's a lot to be said about doing something like that. It tells me a lot about the GM and what they do. I tell you this, there are two coaches that I got all the respect in the world for right now, John. One of them is Saleh from the Jets, who yesterday had one game ball and only one game ball. And he gave it to Nathaniel Hackett. You know why?
Yes.
Because he used to be the head coach over there at the Denver Broncos. And, our buddy decided to talk a bunch of mess about him and suddenly finds himself as probably one of the worst teams in the NFL right now with the Denver Broncos. So, good luck, Sean Payton, you big tool. He's done so many things wrong, John, in the wrong way, and it's just not okay. But it is amazing. But I'll tell you what, I think it's still fun. The NFL still has done a great job of making themselves into an international league as best they can. And they're only going to continue to expand on that, John. And they talked about it over this past weekend again, how much expansion they're going to be doing over into that European market and trying to get that as much as they can. It's tough with the time change, but I think that they're doing a pretty decent job with that.
I agree. And I haven't agreed with a lot of the things that Goodell's done, but that's one thing he's done right, Pete. And I think they're likely with this merger in the XFL and so forth to maybe put that into a true, year-round sort of situation, which football fans love. They'd love to watch it, I think, year-round, Pete. Yep. All right. Thanks for joining us, folks. We will be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Pete, remember, he also has that radio show on Odyssey on WCCO on Sundays. It's 10 a.m. to noon every Sunday. You can pick it up on the Odyssey app or the WCCO link to Odyssey. That's 10 a.m. Central to noon Central. See you tomorrow at 1, everybody.